So I wanted to do a blog about this book by Madeleine L'Engle, which I read again recently. When I read it for the first time, I was a wee little baby Christian in a family that's probably as conservative as the one in the book. And when I read it again more recently, I just had some different thoughts on it. Unlike some of Madeleine L'Engle's other books, this does not have any space travel or aliens in it. It is a slice of life road trip book about a young teenager called Vicky Austin who is beginning to question some of the things that she thought were true about the universe, that the world is a moral place, the world is a just place, and that there's definitely a benevolent God out there somewhere. But as she gets older, she sees some of the more unjust sides of the world, and she has some questions about that. What I want to talk about is a scene towards the middle of the novel when she's talking with her Uncle Douglas, who's kind of a mentor figure for her. And when I read this conversation the first time, I thought, okay, it's just a nice conversation for this book. But when I read it the second time, I was like, some of that's kind of bad advice to give a teenager. So let's kind of get into what these two characters talk about and why it's kind of problematic. So the way Vicky starts off this conversation is, why did Anne Frank have to die? And that actually is a really good question, and the way he starts answering it is just the obvious answer. Because the Nazis put her in a concentration camp. And they talk about how that's not right, but how that is an action by humans, that's not necessarily an action by God. And what they're getting into here is this whole idea of human moral responsibility. Like, if we have the ability to be kind to each other, we also have the ability to do harm to each other. And I think that's a really good point to make. That's definitely very true for how the world works, that our choices will have a dramatic effect on the people around us. And they also give a good example of something that happened to Vicky in one of the previous books, where she rode her bike recklessly, got into an accident, got hurt, and then not only was she hurt by that, but her whole family was worried about her and hurt by her actions. So I think that's kind of a good, appropriate example of human responsibility that makes sense for the character and is age appropriate. However, I think that taking the conversation this way does raise two questions that are never fully answered. The first is that, well, if the reason God doesn't interfere with bad human actions is because of free will and we've got to make our own choices, then what kind of responsibility does God have? For example, sometimes you'll see a really sad story in the news about some toddler getting a hold of his parents' firearm and shooting his baby sister in the head or something terrible like that. So in that situation, is it the toddler's fault if he knows what a gun is and what it does, and he's being reckless with it, just like Vicky was being reckless on her bike? Is he the one who's morally responsible for shooting his sister? Or is it the parents who are responsible for leaving a loaded gun out where their kid can reach it? So in a way, we give human parents a lot more responsibility than Douglas is giving God in this scenario, because we expect that if the parents are more morally developed, more smart than their little kids, that they have to take some responsibility for keeping those kids from doing something really horrible before they have the moral understanding to make good choices. So if God is way farther above us than parents are to their toddlers, doesn't that also give him a certain moral responsibility to keep us from doing terrible things to each other. The second problem with the free will argument is that humans doing bad things to humans is not the only terrible, unjust thing in the world that's brought up in this conversation. Another huge theme in the book is natural disasters and people just dying in freak accidents of nature. One example that shows up later is the town of Frank, which got just demolished in this landslide from the mountain right next to it. In that scenario, it wasn't caused by anyone making a morally bad choice. If God had, for example, sent an angel to tell these people, hey, get out, evacuate your homes, that wouldn't have interfered with their free will at all. So that argument is not really addressed at all by the God has to allow for free will explanation. And the natural disaster problem is addressed in this same conversation, so it's really weird that it doesn't come up again when Douglas gives this explanation, because an example that Vicky brings up is the story of Maggie, this girl who lived with her family for a while because her parents died. And both these parents died because of accidents. I think one died of an illness and the other died in a plane crash. And what's kind of weird is that Vicky says Maggie probably turned out better living with the Austins than she would have if she had lived with her biological parents, because they were kind of crappy parents. And that's never really touched on again, but what is the implication there? That God smited both of these parents because they weren't doing a good job of raising their kid? So God won't interfere with concentration camps because of free will, but if you're crappy parents, God might smite you. So the way the conversation ends is they go into two possible solutions. And one thing that Douglas brings up is the puzzle piece explanation. And here's what he says. You know those puzzles with hundreds of tiny pieces? You take one of those pieces all by itself and it doesn't make much sense, does it? You look at one piece and it doesn't seem to be part of a picture, but you put all the pieces together and you see the meaning of it all. So he's kind of falling back on the God is beyond our comprehension. God is too big for us to really understand. He's got this plan that's out there, but we're never going to see except a tiny piece of it, and it's not going to make sense to us. Which is really moving the conversation to a very uncomfortable place, because God might as well be Cthulhu at that point. He's this fantastic being that we can't comprehend. We'd probably go mad if we tried to comprehend him, and he's so outside our frame of reference that none of our logical systems or moral systems can even apply to him. So at that point, well, there is no good and benevolent God, because our comprehension of good and our comprehension of benevolent don't even apply to him. And that's a pretty terrible place to end up. Douglas's other conclusion is that, well, if you throw out God, then there's just no sense to life at all. And what he says is, but there isn't any point to life without him. Without him, we're just a skin disease on the face of the earth, and I feel too strongly about the human spirit to be able to settle for that. And this just kind of comes the heck out of nowhere. And that he just sort of assumes that there's no sense to life without God, without really saying why that's true or providing any reasons for why that's true. And I guess Vicky just kind of accepts it, because the next couple of paragraphs are just him talking. But it's very strange that he just throws that out there out of nowhere. I think the connection we're supposed to make out of this is comparing Douglas's point of view to that of the straw anti-theist character Zachary, who's a boy that Vicky dates in the book. But even then, Zachary's nihilism is kind of obviously a front for his depression over having a chronic illness. It's not so much that he doesn't believe there are good things in the world, it's that he doesn't want to because he's so depressed about having to miss out on them because he might die soon. So in the end, I think that the argument Douglas gives in this scene is something that wouldn't really make sense unless you're already predisposed to believe that God is the answer and that you have to believe in a good and benevolent God, and you're kind of just looking for justifications to believe that. And that's not something I really noticed when I first read the book. So according to Douglas, what he did was when he found he was having trouble believing in God, he just did the fake it till you make it approach, and he just acted as though he believed in God until he found out that he did believe in God. I'm going to get a little spoilery here because at the end of the book, an earthquake happens, and Vicky decides right after that that she does believe in God, but she also says that it wasn't just the earthquake that helped her make up her mind. She would have believed in God anyway. So that kind of makes me think that she was, like Douglas, predisposed towards belief and just looking for an event to confirm that. So overall conclusion, does Vicky force herself to believe because she's scared not to? And reading this book again as an adult, I wonder if maybe she wasn't fully allowed to pursue her spiritual journey, to keep pursuing her questioning. Like, even if she still identifies as someone who has faith in God, like, she could have kept on questioning through her teen years and into her adult years. But I feel like because she's only presented with this, you have to believe in God, God has to be right, or there's no meaning to life philosophy, she's kind of boxed into a corner where she feels like she has to believe because it's too scary not to.